Good evening. You're listening live to the Extreme Movie Show. I'm your host, Rob. Tonight I'm tackling our continuing review of Silo, Season 1, Episode 4 on Apple TV. This show starring Rebecca Ferguson about a small population of people, about 10,000, I believe, is the number, around a 100-story silo that they're not allowed to leave. And if apparently about 100 or so years have passed since a great event, or whatever they've called it, has led them to be in a situation where they just know what their life is and that's it. And some of the themes I want to talk about with this episode, first of all, kind of echo what we've had in the first three. Let me start off by saying this episode I think is a little bit stronger than the last one, which I was a bit indifferent to. And I think some of you in chat were mentioning how you are intrigued, who found the show interesting, but not necessarily, compelling, let's just say emotionally, where you almost want to keep watching. It's hard to, on a show like this, to I think keep watching it if you're not really, really tied into the characters and writing, because again, a small show that whose biggest problem I think and continues to have is that it doesn't know what kind of show it wants to be. It's got some great layers to it, which we'll dive into here in a moment. But if you're not really getting into the characters or something that drives you to see it, if you don't appreciate a slow burn, the show's probably not going to be for you. This episode's, like I said, better because they get more solid what's going on, and we're halfway through the season, right? So let's talk a little bit about some of those themes that came up and how they get expanded here in the fourth one, because I think there's a major obvious point that has not been discussed over the first three episodes that needs to be mentioned here in episode 4. Now, recently, some shows that are out there as well, such as Rabbit Hole, also covered here on the Extreme Movie Show, has dealt with modern themes here in 2023 in the United States, perhaps even globally, without necessarily calling them out, whether it's the New World Order, artificial intelligence, that sort of thing. What I liked about this show, and still kind of like, is the fact that it's supposedly a science fiction show. You could look at it as more of a thriller. You could look at it more as something that is exploring the dynamics of human relationships, which is what real stories are anyway. It's never the concept or the hook that's presented to you. And here the hook is you have a closed system of people, 2 generations, not coincident in my opinion, maybe 3, that are removed from some big event. So they only know what they know. They live literally inside of a bubble, a silo, if you will, which again is kind of compelling if you think about nuclear war and a nuclear silo. I think that's what most people's minds turn to, or at least the idea that under a silo everything is under one umbrella and everything operates as one. So basically one system of governance. This show has not jumped too much into the politics yet. Clearly you have the higher ups, literally and figuratively, the higher levels, and the people that run the whole silo down at the bottom. That's where our character Juliet, played by Rebecca Ferguson, works. And in this episode does a good job of showing us how she came into that position, although some of the acting I think involves going to be something I'm going to talk about here in a moment, complain about. And the storytelling itself is a little bit of a mess. We're getting more of the flashback stuff, so any anticipation you have of what's going to happen in this episode gets interrupted, and I don't like that. And I know we can have multiple plot lines going on, and one we may appear to enjoy more than the others, and so some things get filled in. But that's always a problem when you have these revolving subplots that can take center stage. One of the other themes that's talked about here too initially seemed to be strong women, because the very first episode, and of course second episode, we see that 2 very strong women have their relationships upended, one in a horrific manner, realizing that she was allowed to be pregnant a third time, and you heard that correctly, allowed to be. It turns out it was a scam, and the shock and disgrace of that led her to want to leave the silo, which is one of the interesting rules they have. If you ask, well, you're going to go no matter what. You can't take it back, and they let you go. And then the other woman's had a issue with her relationship too with the man, and so I thought the relationships were done very well. I don't think the men were necessarily soft or weak or impotent like the way they're typically portrayed in modern media and television. I thought that was a very strong suit to the show that really compelled it going forward, because when 2 people are in love, you think of the sum is greater than the parts, if you're idealistic romantically, that somehow their drive and yearning to be for each other is going to lead them to a certain amount of self-awareness that will overcome 100 years worth of classical conditioning by the generations that have lived and procreated here in the silo. They don't explore it that much. They use it more as a setup for, oh my God, somebody got murdered. What's going to happen? So Juliet, she's going to be made the sheriff now. And that story itself seems like it's ages ago, really, because in front of that, we saw Deputy Barnes, the older sheriff. him and the mayor kind of all of a sudden within about 2 minutes of on-screen time together, maybe a little bit more than that. I'm kind of joshing here a bit, but by the end of episode 3, there's sucky face talking about retiring together and all that, and it's like you could see that with the age roles there, that was appropriate in a way, but it felt like it came on really, really quick. I don't feel that it blossomed and seeded and took well over a couple episodes. It just seemed to be not necessarily out of the blue, but I can see people go, wow, they just made this happen as a distraction because it turns out that the mayor, a strong woman herself, um, they're getting ready to make whoopee, and she ends up being poisoned, it seems, from the water they were drinking when they were going down to get Juliet and tell her about becoming the new sheriff. So that's how episode 3 ended. And I understand this episode, like all the others so far, has ended on a climactic note, right? That's okay, I guess, if you want to live on a cliffhanger. You don't always have to have that. But in here, we do pick up where the action leaves off, where he's beside himself in his place. He's got, was it Ben or whatever, the one dude that we think is probably going to be a bad guy because it seems like he works for the higher ups of the judges or whatever the hell they're called. The people have yet to be talked about, the elites, as it were. And she shows up at the door, and obviously it seems like she's not the type of person that should be a part of their group. So that's going to cause some conflict. We can clearly see that here. Just the way she looks physically at stuff seems to be different than the others. It's I think it's a red herring. I think obviously with her dying, there's a reason behind it, but was the real target him? You know, who poisoned her? You know, was it Barnes himself? Was it somebody else? I mean, who knows? It's just one of those things where you're like, yeah, I get that it's here, but it's distracting from the fact that two people in 2 episodes have left and gone outside, and they had strong reasons why they didn't had to do with the relationships. And now we feel compelled to go, okay, they're going to force us to stay here in a silo and dick around with all this rather than I think the natural intuitive thing, which was when we saw Juliet with her boyfriend, the guy who's also allegedly killed himself or was killed. And that's the crux of her investigation that she wants to get into, and that's why she accepts the position. You know, when those two were on their own seeking the relics and all that, the Sony camera, the Pez dispenser, and all that, I'm really kind of shocked at how their natural curiosity doesn't get the better of them even more. I'm a little shocked too at how, as much as they portrayed the 3 different, or at least 2 different levels of the silo, how that's not more of an emphasis because you basically get the sheriffs on, like, say, level 50, which is about halfway down. So they're equidistant from both halves if they have to patrol it. And the class structure sort of thing is there. You see it, but politically, it hasn't been a thing yet. So they just kind of want to remind us that it's there. But if you're not going to do anything with it, what's the point? So I feel like they're actually getting farther away from the most intriguing thing is what the F is outside the silo and why are they covering it up from us? Really, I mean that's the big tease that's holding us back going from point A to point B, and that's supposed to be the drama. What I did like though about this episode is that we get to see Rebecca Ferguson. What I think is her best acting wise, whether it's a Mission Impossible movies or here, is that when she's just you watch her do what she's doing and acting. I think she's a very good physical actress, meaning you can believe her. She's walking, that she's carrying the weight of emotion upon her, or that she's a little bit scared walking up from the lower floors up to the upper floors where she hasn't been in a very long time. And so you can see that it bothers her, even though she's a young woman, a fully functional, well-to-do adult. And you know, the one part about it that doesn't seem to work for me is the flashbacks of her when she's a little girl with her doctor father that we saw already, about how, you know, her brother and sister and how they may have drowned and how the mother died. And the dad seems to kind of take his grief out in working a lot and ignoring her. And they have their typical shouts about, like, well, she's not coming home. I have to do this because of you. It was interesting, again, without them just watching them's more fun than the dialogue, because there's a scene there between her and her father when she was a young girl after her mom had passed, where like she's cooking in the stove, she's making like eggs or something, but then she's trying to fix a chair that's broke. And that's, of course, we're supposed to understand that she's able to fix things, get involved into that, and that's a precursor to what she does as an adult, right? So she's juggling a couple things at once. The smoker goes off. The dad completely overreacts. They shout at each other and this and that. And I thought, you know, for a show that did such a wonderful job captivating us in the first 2 episodes about strong relationships between men and women, not necessarily family, but lovers, if you want to call that family, to showing us this kind of simple diatribe was a bit embarrassing to me. Um, the father seemed very wimpy. And, he's a doctor, and you'd think, okay, she's got natural intelligence, at least from his side, and a certain cleverness, if you will, mischievous almost or whatever. But she's just, fraught over the, death of her loved one. So I was really hoping that the mother nature's kind of instinct out of a woman was going to really drive a lot of what's going on in the show and make them inquisitive. And for her, it is a little bit. But we're dealing with the big issue in this episode, if you go back and look at all of them now, is the guys are just there. They're not wusses or whatever, but they're wimps. And everybody here, no matter if they're man or woman, they don't have that natural curiosity. I'm telling you, anybody, even if it's only 10,000 people, a very, very small town would be put in, would have about wanting to get the hell out. Everybody's just happy to go about doing their thing. We're all in this together, kind of nonsense bullshit. You're always going to have, at least by the genetic disposition, some people that are naturally curious that no matter what, they're not going to follow rules. They're going to test boundaries and do all that. But all the people we see in the background walking up, carrying whatever they're carrying and doing whatever they're doing is not really filled out or fleshed out. You go, really? Is it this sanitized? Is this really this self-contained? The tension that existed with the two people trying to get out and being curious and how it affected them was really, like I say, emotionally compelling. It made you want to see what happened to them. Not all this talk about this murder mystery that it's devolved into. And while it devolved into it, it's not executed poorly. It's just some of the writing and overacting is kind of awful. So, for example, Barnes mentioned before how he seemed to instantly fall in love, and they both kind of did, and then she dies. Well, milk it at least a little bit here. Don't just have it go for like, a few minutes last episode and then here and that's it. They didn't build up to it. Barnes kind of goes on a emotional rampage for a guy that always seemed very kind of like, okay, he knows what to do in the right situation. He's a think before he acts kind of sort of guy. He's got the age of all these years and experience behind him that he can lean on in this situation. And all of a sudden, a woman he felt compelled to maybe kind of settle down with in his older years, all of a sudden starts overreacting. Even his acting, I'm like, really? It just did not seem like him character wise. And I understand we're supposed to feel his grief with whatever. It just was not believable to me. And the more they might have had screen time together and we saw that develop rather than just the subtle little flirting they did last episode, okay, they could have milked that for something later at the end because we've already had a lady leave. We've already had an earlier sheriff leave that Juliet's replacing. We've already had the death of the mayor, a major figure that actually seemed very likable, not nice, but competent, but also mature, like full of wisdom, which is unusual. They didn't explore that role there at all. And then we have an older couple romance, which I had mentioned last episode, that was interesting to watch how we get to see this dynamic because normally it's young couples in love, and that's all you, for the most part, see in Hollywood TV these days. So it was nice to see that. And now you just get rid of it. And it's like you're doing a little too much here rather than letting things really simmer. You're just kind of forcing them there just to say, well, it's the end of the episode. We've got to do something. That's what it feels like, I think, when you watch this episode. Now, the fact that Barnes and Juliet end up having some conversations, and we know they're going to end up working together. And, how can they trust each other? Well, they both have lost somebody that was really, really important to them and should keep some things to herself and all that. We know that's going to be the backbone of probably the remainder of the episodes. But again, there's almost zero emphasis on what's going on the outside. And I think that's a shame, really, because that's compelling. What drove these people to challenge the nature of the relationship to get out there? You don't get that here. It's literally just a murder mystery. Um, we don't learn anything more about the silo itself. We still, of course, see the one scene that we see in several of the episodes, sometimes multiple times, of the one giant cafeteria where it looks like it's desolate on the outside because it's that grand sweeping vista with like one or two trees in the background, and that's it. It's they really didn't develop that at all, and so this is the frustration I'm having because there's a lot of good seeds here. They all don't necessarily have to go at the same pace, but you're putting a couple of things on hold here to emphasize some others. So again, which type of show you're trying to be? A murder mystery, something that deals with science fiction themes where you really went into it. The cutesy stuff of the relics and artifacts that everybody watching the show goes, oh yeah, that's the Sony recorder. That's a Pez dispenser for you young types. That was a candy thing way back in the day that's still around. That's nice and neat, but we don't need the show to have jokes and be funny. And bouncing back and forth again between some of the flashbacks there for her being a little girl, that would have been much better if we might have saw that early on in episode 1 or 2, and we saw them kind of grow up and they're older and all that, so there's this momentum being built. Here, it's just jumping back and forth. So you're going from, "Oh my god, the mayor's murder," to, "Okay, what's going on here?" When the episode opens and, "Who's this kid on there? Oh, this is the doctor when they're younger and de-aged," and, "Okay, this is a thing that's going on. Okay, okay, now we're back to this. Okay, now it's not working." Again, the episode's better than episode 3. Not nearly as good as the first 2 episodes, which were strong as hell. And with only, I think, 4 more episodes to go, I'm really curious what they're going to do. There was a couple little things there that were neat, such as the fact that when she takes off the old sheriff's position, if we remember, she's got the sheriff's badge the old sheriff wanted her to have that had the word truth written on the inside or engraved. And so she's keeping that because ultimately she's taking the long position, as it were, the macro view of, well, if I'm going to find out what happened to my man, I got to do it from this position because I have the resources to be able to look into this. Although I'm going into a different world with a different game and the rules are different, we'll see how that goes. We'll see how political they get. But as far as a mystery, even like her, for lack of a better term, secretary who came in there and they kind of were bitching at each other, they're going to end up helping each other out. You just do, just because that's just how it is. When they're hating each other early on, they're going to end up being whatever. The show does not do a good job of hiding that. Just like the show does not do a very good job of basically saying, as Sam or whoever it was with the guardians, the bearded guy, they make him seem like the heavy because they make him talk slow like this and say it would be appreciated if we got a really quick response to this and kept everything quiet. It's like, ooh, I'm scared. It's ridiculous. The lack of any fleshing out of who these elite people are and why they're not being questioned is a bit disturbing. Other than the one character that his name escapes me that they saw earlier on, who they brought some scotch to get some answers from. He's supposed to be like a mean guy, and I'm like, he's like the head IT dude, and he knows more, of course, more than what's letting on. So how are we going to get information from him? It's Is it Tim Robbins is the actor, I think. It's it's interesting, but not engaging in this episode. But what's interesting again is I'll go back to the thing that's great when we're just watching Rebecca Ferguson on her own. It's cool. Like I say, she's a physical actress. When she hears something rattling in like the AC unit, you know, she opens it up and there's something in there and she finds it. And because it was stuck in the vent, so, ooh, what else did he hide? How did he hide it? Why did he hide it? What's going on? Stupid things like that are enough if you just watch it happen. You don't need all the words to tell you what's going on. Let us see it for ourselves. I thought actually one thing about the cinematography in here that was good, a little bit different than the other episodes, is while we didn't rely on seeing other shots of maybe some newer levels, like the gardens that we saw before and the downstairs area where we had the big action set piece at the end of last episode. I would like to see more of that, but a lot of the shots of them in town are like almost remind you just a tiny little bit of either, say, Soylent Green or whatever, just with Heston going around talking with people in a really crowded environment, or a little bit like Blade Runner. Shall they try to make it look like a cramped, dense future city, sort of? Not in a good way either, but in a trashy sort of way. Not quite, but a little bit. I don't know why. Maybe it was just the angles with the lights. Very 80ish kind of vibe to it. If you look at it like old, rock music videos or something with the lighting. Um, it's just an aesthetic thing that's not too bad. And it's a shame that they really didn't show us more of the silo in the background while they're walking and doing stuff or something new, because again, that's what the show's named about. It's literal thing, a physical thing, but it's also a metaphor. And that's what the show started off by presenting in a very good way, but is starting to get away from rather rapidly. And it's devolving into how much do I really care about what's going on, trying to find a hook into it. And it better course correct sooner, or unfortunately, I think it's going to lose a lot of viewers. Now, those of you that are interested in all the major details and specifics about stuff, which most of it I left out with some of the conversations between some of the characters when you watch this episode, I think what you're going to do is you're going to start tying those into things that have been made before, such as the fact at the end of the episode, one of the things we get to see is, hey, the lady down there that knows how to work electrical device and has been listening to things, which I think she's trying to listen for a way on the outside, as well as eavesdropping. There's more to her than meets the eye, I'm sure. We kind of knew that already, right? She gets the cell phone or the the camera working a little bit, but we don't know what's on there, so it's going to compel us to want to see it. Okay, that'll be kind of cool. So that might drive it forward. As a mystery, it's doing okay. Again, when the camera's on Rebecca Ferguson, more often than not, as the anchor, it's really, really strong. And for better or for worse, the men here are simply sidekicks. There's nothing strong or prominent about them. I think Barnes as a deputy really let himself go because you see him kind of in a drunken, emotional stupor, beat the shit out of somebody. And it's like, you know, for as good as you look the past few episodes, getting to know this character, this seemed out of character. So it just seemed like a weak writing effort for him. Um, I'm not saying men are the problems and women are the solutions to the show. I hope it turns out not to necessarily be that way, but we're going to find out, or maybe we won't. But like I say, when the show dealt with the couples in love and what happened with the relationships, extremely compelling, even with just a little bit of what's going on there too. But not a lot of focus on other things that if you were in the situation or we're watching it, we want to know, like the economy, what's going on with the kids. How does one learn education? We see Juliet as a young person basically run away, forge her dad's handwriting with a misspelling on there, and it's a nice little adult moment. But then you go, would the father, who's a doctor, who's lost his wife and other kid or kids, really want her to stay down there? Because all he says to her is like, "Are you happy?" And it's like, it's a good exchange. It's done well, but I don't know how believable that is in that situation. That's how she came to be down at the bottom. There's a bit more to it, but that's the crux of it. So I don't know. It's not taking any chances now. It came out of the gate really badass strong, like, hey, take a look at me. It's like, okay, now I'm still watching you. Now what? Because that first act was great. Now you got to follow up with something solid here. I think it's barely getting by. I think if it was a boxing match, we'd say, hey, we got knocked out of the mat or we slipped and we got a standing 8 count. We know we're going to move on, but you better show me something here because going to the later rounds, if you don't, it's going to be on and you're going to lose something. But that's the thing with a lot of the shows today, not just Apple, is that Apple seems to have some interesting elements and some of the other shows do as well that are out there on other ones, whether it's Hulu or Netflix. And sometimes after a couple episodes, you get into it, but a lot of them are very interested in world building rather than characters. And nobody cares about the world. We care about the characters that inhabit the world. Have your characters, make them where you like them, or something compelling about them, and fill the world in to accentuate those characters. Right now, the show's not doing it. And while I'll say this for my final thoughts, I think this episode was a lot better than episode 3. It's still noticeably weaker than 1 and 2. If it's trying to settle into a murder mystery and just kind of keep everything on the back burner and is deciding that's what it's going to be, okay, that's fine. I'll give it that, but we won't know until episode 5. So next week when we take a look at it, it'll be kind of interesting to see how they choose to move forward here. I'm going to check some comments out here and respond to some of them. Yeah, I didn't feel compelled to watch. That's kind of where I'm at a little bit. Um, yeah, everyone is just not curious. I can't understand why. You know, if they really were to go ballsy, Princess, I would say this. I'd mentioned a little earlier, I don't know if you caught it, where I think the time frame is roughly supposedly 100 years since whatever they called it, the great event or something, which of course we think a disaster like a nuclear war or something, right? That 2 generations is enough to lose a lot of skill sets and everything else there too. It's not enough to me to genetically lose that natural inclination of being curious. And while they are being very particular about who is allowed to breed and have babies, they did not dive into it, which could have been a lot better, especially with the fact that Rashida Jones's character had the implant removed allegedly and didn't. I'm like, holy shit, why would that alone itself should make people very kind of whatever. And the fact that as a woman or a man, you're not talking about to your best boy or girl or whatever while you're having coffee or on the job, bullshit. So I'm not going to go as far as to sit there and say that the show's ignoring some of those things, but it almost feels that way, doesn't it? And again, curiosity is not something that you can just genetically get rid of. You can say we only want certain kinds of people, and maybe on a bigger scale led to that. But like shortly here, as you guys here in chat, we're going to find out. I'm getting ready to jump on with Professor Pixel, and we're going to continue our Wayward Pines review. I think we're in episode 5 of that. There was a selection process of the people that ended up in Wayward Pines, and I'll simply leave it at that. That you could almost say, well, we picked people that weren't going to be that way, but some of the conflict they have in there, a result of people being naturally curious what's beside the or outside the wall. You have the exact same thing here. Wayward Pines, for all intents and purposes, is a closed system, and you've got that here in a silo. Why aren't there people just staring out the window? Why don't you have kids playing where they shouldn't be? Why don't you have something else going on there too. And again, when her boyfriend's like, yeah, I think I found a door and I want to see what's on the other side. I'm just curious, and they're whispering it to each other and nobody's eavesdropping. You're like, yeah, you do it out of sheer boredom, if nothing less. What are you going to do when you're working your 40 hours a week in a silo? You can't travel. You can't take vacations. We don't know what's going on with the economy. There doesn't appear to be a lot of schooling going on. Honestly, if you're not drinking, fucking, screwing, or having sex and drugs and all that stuff with it, which there doesn't seem to be any of that normal human stuff going on, you're going to want to kill yourself out of boredom. Lack of vitamin D, a lot of this and that. I just don't know, and they're not going that way with it. They're not trying to explain any of the psychological or biological type of phenomenon that science fiction wise you think would be reasonable, right? I mean, I don't know, unless all of a sudden we hear about something else too. But I really, really thought they were going to show the outside world, a brief moment of it when the turbine went down last episode and then came on, electricity reset. I thought maybe you might see some people that we were starting to see as background characters see for a split second that the outside's green, or that there's birds flying by, or that they're seeing water, or whatever little briefings we saw off the reflection out of number two's the sheriff's when he left in episode 2. I mean, that would have been very compelling, where it's like, okay, how are the elites going to keep everything self-contained when there's this pressure building up because people are now getting very curious? Are they going to kill him? Are they going to put him down? Are they going to brainwash him? Are they going to make him disappear? Are they going to be like everybody else and say, well, we're definitely moving forward in that direction here, but we can't only do blah, 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 and try to slow play it because then they lose their power? That would be compelling. They're not going that way right now at all. I'm not trying to change your mind. I'm simply trying to talk about it. But I, too, like you, am tired of useless men in shows. And let's just talk about Wayward Pines here in a moment when we switch channels, because God forbid we have useless men in that as well. So until next week, when we continue with episode 5, and for better or for worse, when we do these shows, we always do at least the first season, whether we like them or not, and that's just the way it goes. And so right now I'll say this: The Prisoner, that great spy show with Patrick McGowan, we covered half of the episodes I wish they never did. The first 8 would have been absolutely tremendous, some of the best television of all time, as some of the episodes are. But this is starting to go the way of The Prisoner. Some of the episodes I like it, some of them I'm like, oh. So if you're not compelled to watch it, I completely understand. I will fill in the blanks for you and for everybody else. And that's what we do here on the Xtreme Movie Show. Thanks, guys, for checking us out and watching. I'm getting ready to hop out. Wayward Pines we're getting ready to do here as well. And at 7 o'clock, we're going to be doing Of Cooks and Kung Fu. It's a 1979, I believe, Jackie Chan movie about the martial arts versions of different cooking styles. And that's kind of interesting and silly if you like Jackie Chan, and all 3 of us will be doing that. And Tuesday night will be more than likely, we're going to go ahead and officially announce it, our summer movie previews, where we take a look at the next few months of things coming out that we want to talk about and see. I'm in for some pain. I hope you are too, but that's always a fun one to do. So we'll be checking that out. Till then, guys, have a good night. As always, stay extreme.